Well, hello everybody. So, if you had watched the previous presentation, right, we covered the digestive system. Now, here again, this is the endocrine system. This is what's going to be on the next exam, right? Coming up next week is the digestion as well, or digestive system as well as the endocrine system. Um, we had covered the endocrine system at this point probably a month ago. So I figured, right, as far as the fact that it's been that long since we've covered anything on the endocrine system, I'd kind of go back over and just kind of, redo it, and especially the fact that you have the most up-to-date images, as well as this recorded presentation, so you can go back and listen to it, whenever you'd like to. But the endocrine system, right? That is the hormonal system. That is the system by which our body can, primarily communicate. Sure, the nervous system through the brain, that's a means of communication as well. But when we talk about, things like insulin, glucagon, epinephrine, all these different hormones, they too can help to regulate functions of the body, right? Some hormones, they cause a reaction within a few seconds. Some take a few hours. Some may even take upwards of 24 hours, right? Some hormones are cyclic, right? Cortisol, for instance, is released on a cyclic basis. Different hormones like FSH and LH, again, they too are released on cyclic bases. So there's a number of different functions that these hormones can carry out, right? Now the slide on here, right, when we talk about the thyroid gland, talk about parathyroid, the thyroid itself, the thymus, the heart, stomach, kidney, all of these different tissues, or all of these different organs. All of the organs on here all can release hormones. Now, these are not the only ones, even bone tissue or skeletal tissue, that too can release hormones. So these are not all of them, right? But these are many of them. And they all have different functions, right? Some of these we will cover currently here in the endocrine slide, or the endocrine system, while others we really won't cover too much, and they are covered in a different chapter, like the intestines, for instance, like the ovaries, or the uterus, or the gonads, or the testes, right? The gonads, the uterus, the testes, right? The ovaries, they will all be covered in the reproductive chapter. So I'm really not going to spend too much time talking about what their function is. But when we talk about the adrenals, or the thymus, or the pineal gland, or the thyroid gland, right? All of these individual hormones have, various features. Some go on to release further hormones, like the thyroid gland. Right, so depending on which gland it is, that's ultimately going to dictate what action it causes in the body. So always remember, right? Hormones have a specific receptor. Right? If a particular cell does not have a receptor for that particular hormone, that cell is not going to respond to that particular hormone. Right? This target cell, right? The cell that is meant to, the cell that ultimately we want to affect by the hormone has a specific receptor, right, for the hormone. The hormone then binds to the receptor. As the hormone binds to the receptor, now this cell here, that's supposed to be an arrow, right? This cell then changes its function. Right, if it's a cardiac muscle cell and the hormone is epinephrine, it causes the cardiac muscle to increase its activity. If it's, for instance, the small intestine, or the smooth muscle of the small intestine, and there was the release of epinephrine, it would decrease its tone. It would decrease its function. So it all depends on what hormone is released. Right. Not all hormones are released into the bloodstream. Right. There are some hormones which are just locally acting. Again, this is where I get stung by a bee in the back of my hand, and there is this, silver dollar-sized redness which appears. Now, I'm ignoring right? Somebody who is highly allergic to bees, or somebody who goes into anaphylaxis or anything like that, that's very different, right? That's an abnormal release of histamine. That's an abnormal inflammatory response. So in general, or just kind of normally speaking, you can see there's different types of release of hormones. Right? Endocrine, right, release, which is what the slide was just covering, where that particular hormone is released into the bloodstream itself. Paracrine cells, they release their hormone to nearby target cells, like, for instance, that bee sting. The reason why it's localized redness and swelling is because those cells release paracrine hormones, and those paracrine hormones don't travel that far. They just travel in those locally neighboring cells. Now, autocrine cells, right? Paracrine, autocrine, they generally are, you're going to see these in those cells which regulate inflammation, right? Autocrine cells, again, same idea, right? But autocrine cells kind of automate themselves, or they activate themselves, right? The hormone is released from the cell, and then that hormone actually comes into contact with a receptor on the very cell which released that hormone, right? So if you want to talk about a fast-acting hormone, it doesn't get much faster than that, right? In the sense that if the very cell, right, if this receptor here, let's just call it an adrenaline receptor, right? If this hormone releases adrenaline, and if that same cell has the receptor for it, that is the fastest possible route that hormones have, right? That's why it's related to inflammation, because the inflammatory response needs to happen very readily, very quickly. So when we talk about hormones and kind of the regulation of hormones, there's a couple of glands, there's a couple of areas in the brain which are kind of top of the totem pole, right? The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, right, we had previously covered in the nervous system, right? The hypothalamus, you can see, right up in this region right here, right? That is the hypothalamus. There's a better image here in just a minute. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are going to kind of function together. But the hypothalamus is actually going to control the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland releases a huge number of hormones, all of which we're going to go over. But the hypothalamus is what dictates whether or not the pituitary ultimately releases these different hormones. So, again, a little better image. Hypothalamus is right here. This right here, this is the pituitary. Right, you can see where it is. Right, if you remember, right, this bone is the sphenoid. Right, this bony structure here that the pituitary lies in, that's the sella turcica. That's the sella turcica. So, anyways, right here, that is the pituitary gland. So when we look at kind of the makeup, when we look at the histology, at the cells of the pituitary gland, it looks something like this. Right? One of the things, right, when we look at this, you can just tell. The anterior pituitary, or again, all of this here, is much, much darker, deep, purple. The posterior pituitary, again, this is all out through here, right, on this side, you can see how much lighter it is. And the issue, or not the issue, but the reason why that is, the anterior pituitary is going to both produce as well as secrete a number of different hormones. So because of that, it's much more metabolically active, has a much greater level of proteins. It just has a much greater density of cells because of the fact that the anterior pituitary actually produces the hormones it's going to release. And if you remember, right, when we talk about cell and kind of the density and all these purple circles, Remember, the nuclei specifically of the cell is what uptakes that purple dye, and that's what these little purple kind of circles are, all in through here, right? All these purple circles you see, right? From there to there, right? Those are the nuclei. The nuclei are very dense, they're very compact, so because of that, they absorb an enormous amount of the dye. Now, in the posterior pituitary, you can see how many fewer, I mean, just in this box, right? I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, if I counted maybe 25 different nuclei. By relatively the same size box, there is, I don't know, 100 nuclei, so the number of cells in the anterior pituitary is significantly greater. So, in the posterior pituitary, again, it does not produce any hormones. Right? The posterior pituitary is going to store, well, it's going to release 2 different hormones. That's it. Right? That's oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. But whereas the anterior pituitary, again, the anterior pituitary both produced and secreted. The posterior pituitary, all it does is secrete. Right? So the fact that all it does is secrete these hormones, that gives rise, or that is the reason as to why there's so many fewer cells which are present, because it's nowhere near as metabolically active. Again, here just kind of a macro image of the pituitary, right? All up and through here. Well, I mean, this entire lobe, right? That's the posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, right? This here, mouse, right? This lobe over here, right on the left side, that is the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary. So when I had mentioned, right, there's a number of different hormones that the anterior pituitary is going to release. You can see it releases ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, or something called corticotropin, right, something called prolactin, right? It releases FSH and LH, TSH, and GH, or growth hormone. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. LH, luteinizing hormone. Again, PRL, prolactin. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now the different cells, for instance, when we look at the corticotroph, that's the specific cell which is going to produce and release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So what has to happen? Way up here in the hypothalamus, just a couple of minutes ago, I had mentioned how the hypothalamus it can release hormones which either stimulate or prevent the further release of hormones. So in the hypothalamus, that releases something called corticotropin releasing hormone. That corticotropin releasing hormone, in a minute we're going to look at how, but that corticotropin releasing hormone travels down and actually binds to the corticotroph. When it binds to that corticotroph then produces ACTH. That ACTH dumps into the bloodstream, and that ACTH then ultimately travels around the body, but the specific cells which have a receptor to it are in the adrenal gland, or specifically in the zona fasciculata. Right. So again, it's not like it travels directly to the adrenal glands. It doesn't. It dumps in the bloodstream. It travels around the blood, and then once it comes into contact with cells that have a receptor for it, those cells are then stimulated. Again, same could have been applied to growth hormone. Right? From the hypothalamus, there is something called growth hormone. releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone travels down. It binds to the receptor on the somatotroph, and that somatotroph then releases growth hormone. And that growth hormone then travels and binds to different receptors on skeletal muscle, on different organs, on muscle, skeletal tissue. Right? There's a number of functions that the growth hormone is going to carry out. That's just a couple of examples. Now, when we look a little bit closer into how is it growth hormone, releasing hormone, or just how is it hormones in general, get from the hypothalamus, and how is it they actually get down to the anterior pituitary? Right? How does that actually occur? That's the next slide we're going to look at. Right here, right, this is something called the hypophyseal portal system. Right, the hypophyseal portal system. And there's this series of blood vessels. Remember, blood is a one-way flow. Right, it flows in through the arteries and the arterioles into the arterial side of the capillary bed, and then from the arterial side of the capillary bed, it exits via the venous side. There's one-way flow. So think about it. I'm going to outline in purple. Right? Here's the hypothalamus. Right, in purple. There's the hypothalamus. Well, the hypothalamus releases whatever hormone, doesn't matter. I'll just say that blue circle. That's, well, whatever, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or growth hormone releasing hormone. It's an endocrine hormone, so once it's produced, it dumps into the bloodstream. Right? If you have a stream or a creek or a river, or even if you don't, just imagine taking a toy ship, right, or something that floats, and throw it into a stream. What's going to happen to it? Well, it's going to go downstream, right? The current carries it downstream. Yeah, same exact thing occurs in the hypophyseal portal system. The hypothalamus dumps that hormone. So again, let's imagine that this blue dot here is growth hormone releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus dumps growth hormone releasing hormone into the bloodstream, and then that hormone travels downstream, and eventually comes into contact with the somatotrophs. Again, the somatotrophs, those are the cells within the anterior pituitary which have receptors for growth hormone releasing hormone, and they are stimulated to produce growth hormone. Again, another example is corticotropin releasing hormone. Right, same idea as I had mentioned. Right, if the hypothalamus were to release growth hormone, or I'm sorry, corticotropin releasing hormone. Let's imagine that's corticotropin releasing hormone, travels down the venous system, it comes into contact with those corticotrophs. Those corticotrophs then release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Right, that is the way it works for, again, if the anterior pituitary, if we want to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Right. Up here in the hypothalamus, it releases something called thyrotropin releasing hormone. That thyrotropin releasing hormone travels to the anterior pituitary via the hypophyseal portal system. That thyrotropin releasing hormone comes into contact with thyrotrophs, which are the cells which produce thyroid stimulating hormone. Right. Now, thyroid stimulating hormone, that's a hormone which then leaves the pituitary, and again, I say leaves the pituitary, let's just imagine it's, here's thyroid stimulating hormone. When it's dumped into the bloodstream, it then leaves via the veins en route eventually to the thalamus. Right? Remember, those cells of the thalamus, or I'm sorry, not the thalamus, excuse me, the thyroid, excuse me, right? The thyroid, TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone, right? That's dumped into the blood, and that leaves the hypophyseal portal system en route to the thyroid, right? In the thyroid, right, there are little cells called follicular cells. They are what are ultimately stimulated to begin to produce thyroid hormone. Right, so it doesn't matter if it's luteinizing hormone or FSH, right? In that case, the hypothalamus releases something called gonadotropin releasing hormone, and the same thing happens. That gonadotropin releasing hormone travels all the way down to the anterior pituitary. It comes into contact with the receptor on those gonadotrophs, and those gonadotrophs produce FSH and LH, and it's then dumped into the bloodstream. And then that FSH and that LH, depending on the sex of the person, either travel to the ovaries, or they travel to the testes, or they travel to the uterus. Right, so all of them function like this. And again, here's just kind of another kind of example, right? I'm not going to belabor the point, but we just talked about it, where you have the release of those different hormones into the blood, and they travel down to whatever respective cell has that particular receptor for that hormone. So when we talk about, all right, so that's how we get the release of, for instance, cortisol, or how is it we get a release of thyroid hormone? Well, it all has to do with blood levels, right? It's a negative feedback loop, right? If the fact that corticotropin releasing hormone, for instance, corticotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of corticotropin. Corticotropin then stimulates the release of cortisol. Well, if cortisol was just released, and if cortisol levels are elevating, do we need to have further release of cortisol? Unless we had some major problem or super stress. No, we don't. If cortisol was just released from the adrenal gland, that means cortisol levels are elevating. If they're elevating, do we need to release more? No. So what happens is as cortisol is released, that is going to actually inhibit the further release of corticotropin from the pituitary, as well as corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Now, one of the other things about the hypothalamus is it doesn't only cause the release of various hormones. Something else it can do is actually prevent or inhibit the release of certain hormones. Like, for instance, right, the hypothalamus can release growth hormone, releasing hormone, or it can release something called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Right, growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates the production of growth hormone. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone actually prevents the release of growth hormone. And again, the hypothalamus can do, a number of different inhibiting and releasing hormones. It's not only growth hormone. But you can see kind of one of the things with growth hormone as well as growth hormone inhibiting hormone, right? With growth hormone, right? Growth hormone, okay. Growth hormone, we want to essentially, when we have elevated levels of growth hormone, that's going to cause an increased stimulus of tissue repair, tissue synthesis, tissue growth, that sort of thing. So in those times of, for instance, when the blood is hypoglycemic, or haven't had a meal in a while, or if blood sugar levels are beginning to drop a little bit, one of the things the body can do is release a small amount of growth hormone. Now, why would it do that? Well, growth hormone, as I just mentioned, growth hormone functions to increase tissue synthesis, right? In a number of different tissues, but Cliff Notes, that's what it does, right? Increases the tissue synthesis of a variety of tissues. That requires massive amounts of energy. So if it requires massive amounts of energy, that means growth hormone is going to stimulate the release of glucose into the bloodstream. So that's the reason why if we're hypoglycemic, we have low blood glucose. If we have the release of growth hormone, that's going to increase, right, blood glucose levels. Right, deep sleep. Deep sleep also stimulates the release of growth hormone. Right, sympathetic activity. Yeah, exercise, for instance. Right, increased levels of amino acids in the blood. All of those things are going to stimulate growth hormone release. Now, if somebody is in the opposite, let's say if somebody is hyperglycemic. Oh, I just ate a bunch of food. Right? Let's just say let's just imagine we ignore pathology like diabetes and stuff like that for a minute. If somebody's hyperglycemic, just ate a bunch of food. Right? If I have elevated levels of fatty acids or elevated levels of glucose in the blood, that's triggering the fact that I must have just consumed food. Right? So if I've just consumed food, right, I need to, one, digest that food, and two, I need to begin to store or have the ability to store the excess glucose, the excess fatty acids, so therefore there isn't elevated levels of blood glucose in the blood as well as elevated levels of fatty acids in the blood. So in times of, again, increased adiposity, increased food consumption, right? Increased fatty acid levels, increased glucose levels, all of those things are going to inhibit the release of growth hormone. Now, when I say it inhibits the release of growth hormone, yeah, what's actually happening is you actually have the release from the hypothalamus of something called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Right? And the other route, right, just like we saw a moment ago when we talked about I think it was ACTH or it was corticotropin, is when you have the release of growth hormone, right? If growth hormone is released out into the body, that means growth hormone levels are going to elevate. Well, if growth hormone levels are elevating, do we just want them to continuously elevate and elevate and elevate and elevate? No. We don't want that to happen. Right? So once they're elevated, once growth hormone levels elevate, that then halts the release of growth hormone releasing hormone. If we don't have the release of growth hormone releasing hormone, then growth hormone is no longer released. Right? That's the whole basis behind, again, a negative feedback mechanism. If we want to enact a change, and once the change has occurred, then we stop making the change. Right? If a tower is tipping to the left, we push it to the right so it stands up straight. We don't just keep pushing it to the right until it falls over. Now we've gone too far the other way. Same idea. Right? If blood glucose, or I'm sorry, growth hormone levels are, let's imagine if growth hormone levels were low, if they were low, what do we want to do? Well, we want to elevate growth hormone levels. So growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates the release of growth hormone from the somatotrophs in the anterior pituitary. And when that happens, growth hormone levels begin to rise. Do we want them to continuously rise? No. Once they reach that level of normalcy, let's just imagine here's the level of normalcy, as soon as they're approaching that, we immediately stop and halt the release of growth hormone releasing hormone, which then stops the release of growth hormone. So therefore, growth hormone levels stop elevating, and they plateau. Again, that's an example of a negative feedback loop or a negative feedback mechanism. So with the posterior pituitary, right, there was the anterior pituitary that both produced and secreted the variety of different um, hormones. The posterior pituitary, or something called the neurohypophysis, right, that's going to release hormones, but in a very different way. Right? These hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. Right? They're produced in the hypothalamus, not in the posterior pituitary. And what actually stimulates the release of these hormones is neuronal stimulation of the hypothalamus. Right? Way up here in the cell body of the neuron, this is where the hormones are produced. There's two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. They're produced way up here in the cell body. Right? If you remember those things called the endoplasmic reticulum, way back from chapter 3, the last semester, right? You would see, once the antidiuretic hormone, once the oxytocin is produced, it would then travel down the axon, all the way until it reached the axon bulb, or the end terminal here. Now, do not think this traveling down, do not confuse that with depolarization. Right, depolarization is what's going to lead to, with saltatory conduction, right, as the action potential travels down the axon of the cell. Right, that's entirely different than what we're talking about here. Right, here we're talking about actual anterograde movement, or basically traveling of the hormones along the axon. That occurs over days and days, and it is a much, much, much different process than depolarization. All right. So, whereas in the anterior pituitary, right, there was the hypophyseal portal system. Here, right, with the posterior pituitary, it's something called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. The hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Right. Now, that is the tract, again, that's the tract which allows those axons of those neurons to travel from the hypothalamus down to the neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary. Again, you can see right here, same idea as before, right? Oxytocin traveling to the uterus, the mammary glands, ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, traveling to the kidneys, to the arterioles. Right, antidiuretic hormone, antidiuretic. All right, it's going to cause your body to retain fluid. Right, oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to function to cause the myometrium, or the uterus muscle, the uterine muscle, to contract. The other thing oxytocin is going to do is that causes milk ejection, right, from the mammary glands. Much different than that of prolactin. Prolactin actually causes the production of milk. Oxytocin, that actually causes the contraction of the myometrium. So here's where we're going to start to get into some of the different glands, right, of the body outside of the hypothalamus, outside of the pituitary. Now here's the thyroid gland. You can see where it is, right here, right, thyroid cartilage up and through here, right. When you look at men, you see that colloquially called the Adam's apple, right. Everybody has thyroid cartilage. Only males have that thyroid cartilage, or that kind of enunciated thyroid cartilage, because of the testosterone spike in puberty. Right? But when we look, right, you can see where the thyroid is, and it kind of almost has kind of a large section here, a really thin bridge, and this large section here. Yeah, here we have the left lobe, something called the isthmus, or the bridge, and then we have the right lobe here. Right lobe here, left lobe here, and then we have the isthmus right here. If you'll recall, right, something called thyrotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. thyrotropin releasing hormone travels to the pituitary. The pituitary then releases TSH. That TSH then travels around the body. When it comes into contact with the receptor on the follicular cell inside of the thyroid gland, that's when the thyroid then pumps out thyroid hormone. Right, so it's kind of a multi-tiered, multi-step process that we're talking about. Again, here's just a closer look of the thyroid gland. This next image is going to be an actual kind of histology, histologic view of the thyroid gland. Follicular cells, or those follicular cells that I had mentioned that have the receptor for thyroid stimulating hormone present. The fact that these follicular cells, again, the fact that these follicular cells here, right, these are the cells which all surround any of these cells that surround this here. Not bad. All right. Getting used to it. Woohoo! All right. Right, all the cells along this line here, those are follicular cells. Now, they're called follicular cells because, for instance, this thing I've circled here, this one here, there's another one here. All right, now I'm just getting lazy. This one here. Right, all of these things are called follicles. I only circled 4 of them. There's, I don't know, probably 50 of them on the screen. Right, but these are all called follicles. These are what are going to produce the thyroid hormone. Now, we see over here something called colloid. Yeah, that's eventually what's going to become thyroid hormone. Right, that's eventually what's going to become thyroid hormone. And you can see these cuboids, or these follicular cells, are cuboid in shape. Right, they are cuboid in shape, and it's these follicular cells which are going to produce the thyroid hormone. One other cell type that we see here are called parafollicular cells. The parafollicular cells, these are going to produce something called calcitonin. Calcitonin is a hormone which is going to cause the uptake or the absorption of calcium. Right? Think of calcitonin in the bone. Right? Calcitonin causes the bone to uptake calcium. Right? So calcitonin or calcium goes in the bone. So again, calcitonin causes, or calcitonin, or once calcitonin is released, that stimulates that calcium to enter from the blood into the bone. Then again, right here we can see, right, the follicle up close and personal. Recall that thing a second ago. I had drawn kind of that blue line around it. That was a follicle. Yep, here's just an up close and personal view of what that follicle looks like right here. And you can see, right, these follicular cells produce this colloid. That colloid is what's going to become, right, thyroid hormone. You see thyroglobulin? Yeah, that's eventually what's going to become thyroid hormone. Right? Oh, beautiful, beautiful cuboid, cuboid-shaped cells. All right, cool. So here, right, as far as the method of release, how is it releases? From the hypothalamus, right, there was the release of thyrotropin releasing hormone. That thyrotropin releasing hormone travels to the travels to the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary. It stimulates the thyrotrophs to release thyroid stimulating hormone, and then that thyroid stimulating hormone travels the body and eventually comes into contact with the follicular cells inside of the thyroid. In turn, they then produce thyroid hormone. Awesome. You can see T3 and T4 right here in step 4 are released by the thyroid. Awesome. So when that happens, right, T3 and T4 levels begin to rise and elevate. So if they begin to rise and elevate, do we want to have continuous release of them? And perhaps if your thyroid was that low, but on just a normal basis, No, once thyroid levels are elevating, once they elevate to that normal range, we want to stop them from elevating. So, as they elevate, that's going to inhibit, see right here, that's going to inhibit the release of thyrotropin releasing hormone. So as thyroid hormone levels elevate, that prevents thyrotropin releasing hormone from being released, which prevents thyroid stimulating hormone from being released, which prevents thyroid stimulating hormone from binding to the thyroid gland, which ultimately leads to, or prevents the release of thyroid hormone. So again, that's just one of the ways we can regulate thyroid hormone release. Now, if I were to pull off the thyroid gland, spin it around, I would see on the back side of the thyroid gland these four little kind of small nodules. Right, those are the parathyroid gland. Right, the parathyroid gland. You see it right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, you see it from the posterior aspect. You see it from the back side. Where you are not able to see these from the anterior side of the neck. Now, the parathyroid gland, you can see it again. Here's this whole gland that you see here. This whole thing you see here is the thyroid. That's all thyroid. Right. The parathyroid gland, here's 1, 2. Because of the way this is turned, right, the thyroid is actually turned a little bit kind of that way. So because of that, you can't see, but there would be one nodule here and one down here as well. Those you don't see, unfortunately. Right, but that's where they are. They're embedded into the wall of the thyroid. So that's one of the reasons why histologically it looks something like this. Right, out and through here. Right, out and through here. These are all follicles. Remember this kind of purplish, purplish stuff in here? That's colloid, right? That's what's going to become thyroid hormone. But because of the fact that the parathyroid gland is embedded in the wall of the thyroid, this all here, right? This big, huge acorn-looking thing. This is the parathyroid gland, right there. That is the parathyroid gland, right? And the parathyroid gland is going to produce something called parathyroid hormone. Again, or parathormone. Choice is yours, totally up to you. But you can see here in this image, kind of the proximity, right? This over here, just like we saw in the image, right? The follicles here. And then directly beside it, those parathyroid cells, right? But parathyroid hormone, or parathormone, right? That's going to function to increase or stimulate the release of calcium from the blood, right? So remember calcitonin. So in high blood calcium levels, calcitonin is released, and that causes calcium to go from the blood into the bone. Parathyroid hormone does just the opposite, right? When blood calcium levels are low, and that's the one kicker. They don't even have to be low. Just when they're getting lower, that's when parathyroid hormone is released. That way, calcium can elevate before it actually gets low, right? And it's not only that, okay, blood calcium just is stripped from the bone. It's not just that simple, right? Something else that parathyroid hormone is going to do, a couple things. One, it's going to cause the release of something called calcitriol from the kidneys. Right? Calcitriol is going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to increase the absorption of calcium from the diet. Right? The second thing is it's going to inhibit or decrease the amount of calcium that is lost through the urine. Right? And again, that directly counteracts what calcitonin does. Right? Calcitonin functions to reduce blood calcium levels. They're already elevated, or they're elevating. So to prevent them from getting elevated or from getting too high, calcitonin is going to stimulate your body to begin to store that calcium. So if we think about what bony cell has to increase its function, it's osteoclasts, or I'm sorry, or osteoblasts, as well as osteocytes. Here is the adrenal gland. Right, we've mentioned at least the hormone which comes from the adrenal gland a few different times. Right, but you can see where the adrenal gland is. Right here are the kidneys. Here, the adrenal gland just kind of acts like a hat. Right here. Again, that is the adrenal gland. This is what it looks like. Right, up close and personal. Again, here's the kidney. Here's the kidney. And then you have the adrenal gland. Kind of acts like a little hat, if you will. But there's different layers, different regions in the cortex. Right, there's kind of two different main areas, if you want to think of it like that. Think of a peach. Right, there's the pit of the peach, or kind of the middle part of the peach. That's something called the medulla. That's this down here. That's going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? The adrenaline. You've heard of adrenaline, right? Right. My red circle's a little high, right? But it's okay. The regions which exist, you can see out in here, right, this outermost region. This is something called the zona glomerulosa. Within the urinary system, there are things called glomeruli. We haven't talked about them yet. We will. Right. This is what they have their impact on. The zona glomerulosa. The zona glomerulosa is going to release something called aldosterone. Aldosterone helps to regulate blood volume, just like anti-diuretic hormone does. Right? Anti-diuretic hormone causes the body to retain volume, or to retain fluid. Aldosterone does the same thing. How it got there was different, for sure. It was an entirely different process, but the end result is the same. And the region of the adrenal gland which causes this release is aldosterone. The next layer. From here all the way down to here. The zona fasciculata. The zona fasciculata. If you'll recall, way up in the hypothalamus, right, there was something called, let's try that one again. Something called corticotropin, releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, then stimulated the release of ACTH from the pituitary. That ACTH goes and comes into contact with the cells of the zona fasciculata, and the zona fasciculata then releases what are called glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol. Right? Different glucocorticoids, I'm sure you've all heard of cortisol. Right? But other glucocorticoids that you've undoubtedly heard of are things like cortisone or hydrocortisone. If you've ever heard about anybody getting this anti-inflammatory injection, like as far as like a steroid, yeah, what they're talking about is different glucocorticoids like hydrocortisone, like cortisone. That's what they're actually talking about. Right? Cortisol is one of those. Cortisol is an anti-inflammatory. Next, here to here. We can see something called the zona reticularis. This is going to secrete weak androgens. Those are just weak sex hormones, like weak testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Right? They come from the zona reticularis. Right? This is women after menopause. Right? As their ovaries have pretty much waved bye-bye. Right? They can still produce estrogen, nowhere near to the level for which they once did, but this level, this region here of the adrenal gland, this is the particular level for which they can begin to and continue to produce these sex hormones. A little redundant here. Sorry. This image, right, this is what causes the eventual release of aldosterone. Aldosterone, if you remember, functions just like anti-diuretic hormone. How it got there, or the end result, is the same, but how it got there is different. Right? Anti-diuretic hormone is going to work on something called the collecting duct. We have not covered the urinary system yet, so I'm not going to talk too much specifics, but the different part of the kidney, right? The anti-diuretic hormone affects one part of the kidney, whereas aldosterone affects another part of the kidney. But the end result is the same. It's to retain blood volume. So let's say if we have some sort of deficiency, we're dehydrated. It is unbelievably, unbearably hot out, and we are sweating profusely, losing large amounts of liquid. All right, so our blood volume decreases. If our blood volume decreases, what happens to blood pressure? All right, it also decreases. That's a problem. If our blood pressure has to be a certain level. If not, that means there's not enough pressure for that blood to reach the vital tissues of the body. So we've got to get this blood pressure back up. So the kidneys release something called renin. The liver releases something called angiotensinogen. They then have a baby. Renin and angiotensinogen have a baby called angiotensin 1. That angiotensin 1, through something called angiotensin converting enzyme in the lungs, is converted into something called angiotensin 2. If you've ever heard of an ACE inhibitor, this right here, again, ACE inhibitors inhibit ACE from making this conversion. So if you're on an ACE inhibitor, this conversion does not take place. So if this conversion does not take place, that means none of the rest of this takes place. Now, does that mean, oh my gosh, I can't control my blood pressure? Not at all. Right? We have many different ways to control our blood pressure. But if we have fewer ways, then we have lesser control over it. But the whole idea is if this whole part didn't take place, that means we would actually increase the amount of fluid which was lost from the urine. If we reduce the volume, if we reduce the volume of blood, we reduce the pressure. Hence the reason why somebody would be on a diuretic if they have hypertension, if they have high blood pressure. If I have high blood pressure, I get put on one of the options is a diuretic. There's many options, that's one of them. And that causes me to get rid of excess, well, not even excess, that just causes me to get rid of more fluid in the body. So just yet again another example of a negative feedback loop. Just another example. I've given you like 7 or 8, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I am moving on. Here, the pancreas. Right, when we've talked about the pancreas in digestion, right? The pancreas plays a dual role. One from an endocrine standpoint, as well as another from the digestive standpoint. Its digestive contribution we talked about in digestion. Right? As far as its hormonal contribution, that's what we're going to take a look at here. Where you can see where it is, right? Here's a great image, but you can see where, right, the pancreas itself, through the pancreatic duct into the duodenum, this is where those digestive enzymes are going to end up. Right? Don't think that that's where the hormones end up. No, the hormones are going to dump into the bloodstream. But here we can see, right around the epigastric region, right? If you kind of push into your epigastric region, that would be your stomach. You'd pretty much be pushing on, right? Your stomach is kind of like right here and kind of wraps around like this, right into the duodenum. Right, there's the stomach. So the stomach really overlies much of the pancreas. So in this particular image, right, that's one of the things that's been removed is the stomach, so you can actually see the pancreas. All right. But there's a structure inside of the pancreas, which is where the hormones are going to be released. And that's something called the islet of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islet. Again, that's this structure here, right? The pancreatic islet. Now, the pancreatic islet, this, whether it's insulin, somatostatin, pancreatic polypeptide, glucagon, all of them are going to be released from the pancreatic islet. The pancreatic acidosi over here, again, this is, again, this example of one here, 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 right? There's 200 of them on this slide, right? These are what release the digestive enzymes. We covered those in digestion. The islets of Langerhans here, they are significantly outnumbered by the pancreatic acidosi. There are significantly greater numbers of the pancreatic acidosi, right? Probably a level of 9 or 10 to 1, right? There's significantly fewer islets of Langerhans or pancreatic islets compared to that of the pancreatic acidosi. So just kind of another kind of example as far as kind of the antagonistic effect or the agonistic effect of certain hormones. Here, glucagon and insulin, they are opposites of one another, right? We see insulin here, accelerated, facilitated diffusion of glucose into the cell, speeds conversion of glucose into glycogen, increases uptake of amino acids, speeds synthesis of fatty acids. Yeah. Insulin functions so as blood glucose levels, as they elevate, as blood glucose levels elevate, insulin levels are going to elevate along with it. And why? Because the entire function of insulin is to lower blood glucose levels. That's the entire function of glucose. So to lower blood glucose levels, I can store that glucose as glycogen. I can store that glucose as adipose tissue. Right. So that's why insulin is going to stimulate the the process called lipogenesis, meaning fat production. It's also going to stimulate the process of glycogenesis, which is the production of glycogen. At the same token, insulin is going to inhibit the release of or it's going to inhibit the process of lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fats. Again, insulin wants to build fat. Well, excuse me, let's back up. Insulin doesn't want to build fat. Insulin wants to lower your blood glucose levels. That is its job. That's what it is supposed to do. If blood glucose levels are elevated, insulin's not the bad guy. It's doing its job. Right? Your blood glucose levels are elevated. Elevated levels of blood glucose are a bad thing. Right, so insulin is released, and it lowers blood glucose levels. As blood glucose levels are, as they elevate, insulin is released, causing the glucose to be stored. As it's stored, blood glucose levels begin to decrease, and they then normalize. Glucagon is the exact opposite. Right? This is, I haven't eaten in whatever, 5, 6, 8 hours. Right? As your blood glucose levels begin to drop, as they begin to fall, glucagon is going to stimulate the release of glycogen, meaning it's going to convert glycogen back into glucose. So that's going to help to elevate blood glucose levels. As blood glucose levels elevate, as they normalize, that inhibits the further release of glucagon. So one other thing to think about is, okay, I'm just going to pose a question and think about it. Would glucagon and insulin be released at the same time? No. Right? They are whatever, staunch. What's the word? Whatever. They are exact opposites of one another, and they are released by the same exact structure within the same organ. There's a reason as to why that is. Right? Obviously, this is under much greater regulation if you have the same one. If the same organ releases two, antagonistic hormones, that's ideal. But if the same structure, it's not the same cell, but if the same structure releases these opposing hormones, leads to a much greater, much refiner control over the release of these particular hormones. So when we look at kind of the release of blood glucose or insulin or glucagon, where there's something else which can happen. Now, this is kind of to the stress response, which, it's, more so to do with adrenal hormone and not so much, right? The long-term stress response actually impacts all of the different hormones. I don't want to say all, I hate blanket statements. Impacts, in one way or another, impacts all of the hormones of the body. However, it directly impacts a huge number. FSH, growth hormone, corticotropin hormone, right? Thyrotropin releasing hormone. There's a number of different hormones which it is going to impact. Right? So temporarily, acutely, right? Epinephrine is released. Epinephrine stimulates the release of glucose as well as fatty acids into the bloodstream. Right? Epinephrine wants to mobilize energy stores. It's going to increase heart rate. It's going to increase heart contractility. It's going to lead to the constriction of vessels to some of the digestive organs. At the same token, it's going to dilate the vessels to skeletal muscle, for instance, or to your lungs as well. Right, so there's a number of things that acute short-term stress is going to do. And that's okay. Like, it's meant to be there. Short-term acute stress, that's meant to get us out of the predicament we're in. The kicker is long-term chronic stress. That's a problem. Think about it. As I mentioned with acute short-term stress, you have the elevated levels of epinephrine, adrenaline, therefore that stimulates the release of fatty acids, and it stimulates the release of glucose into the bloodstream, which means blood glucose levels are going to elevate, which then causes what? Well, if blood glucose levels elevate, insulin levels have to elevate along with it. Well, insulin stimulates glycogenesis as well as it stimulates lipolysis. As well as lipogenesis. So when that happens, that blood glucose, which was stored as glycogen, for instance, can now get stored as adipose tissue. Furthering the problem, right, in prolonged stress, the prolonged release of cortisol, right? Cortisol stimulates lipolysis, the breakdown of fats. And it also stimulates the production of glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. All of these things are going to increase blood glucose levels, which, guess what? That stimulates the release of insulin. Now, insulin elevates, and that blood glucose level begins to be stored in the liver, adipose tissue, skeletal muscle, etc. But it just helps. It promotes that long-term dysregulation or that long-term, inability or receptivity of the receptor to insulin. Right? This is why prolonged stress is significantly correlated with insulin resistance. Right? Because remember, the receptor of a hormone can up-regulate and down-regulate, meaning it can become more sensitive or less sensitive. Right? So if we have long-term elevated levels of insulin, the insulin receptor is going to down-regulate, or it's going to become less sensitive. So that means we have to have more and more and more insulin present in order for that receptor to respond in the same way. So again, this is why long-term stress can lead, is one of the things which can lead to insulin resistance, diabetes, obesity, that sort of. Here, the pineal gland. Right, we mentioned this in the nervous system as well. Right, that pineal gland. This is what's going to release melatonin. Right, this is what it looks like. Almost kind of looks like a tooth. Right, the pineal gland is not particularly big. Right. Remember, melatonin is what is going to regulate your circadian rhythm. Right, circadian rhythm is much more than just your sleep-wake cycle. It's basically the rhythm in which your hormones are released on, right, that cyclic basis. As I mentioned, cortisol is released on a cyclic basis, right? FSH, LH, right? They are released on cyclic bases, right? So there's a reason as to why that is, and it has to do with the release of melatonin. Another gland, right? Another gland that we see, something called the thymus. Now, this is the thymus of an adolescent. This next image, this is the thymus of, again, here is a newborn on the left. Well, I'm pot committed now. I might as well try and write the whole thing. Newborn. Right. Here's an adult. I'll just put A. And I'll put AD. After death. Anyways, look at the size. I mean, look at the size of the thymus. That's the thymus. Right? Here's the heart. So in a fetus, in the newborn, the thymus is just as big as the heart. In a fetus, it's even bigger. In an adult, it's a complete opposite. Right? Here's the size of the heart, and the thymus has significantly shrunken in size. And it does so. And even until we, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it continues to shrink. Right? Earliest in life, fetus, newborn. That's when the thymus is gigantic. And the thymus, as far as its function, remember, right, the thymus is going to it's going to release what are called thymosins. Right? Thymosins are what are going to stimulate the maturity of what will become T lymphocytes. In the bone, there's a process called hemopoiesis. It's blood cell production. Right? That blood cell production, one of the cells which are produced, or the lines which are produced, are white blood cells. Some white blood cells remain in the bone, some leave and mature in the thymus through the addition of these thymosins, which are produced by the thymus. So when that happens, what's produced are T lymphocytes. Those are the guys which are responsible for cell-mediated immunity. Adipose tissue. Adipose tissue. We talked about adipose tissue, right? You would have talked about that in adipose tissue would have also been covered last semester as well. But one of the things with adipose tissue is it does release hormones. A couple different hormones, actually. One called leptin and something called adiponectin. Right? Leptin is one of the hormones released via adipose tissue, which deals with satiation, right? Or I'm full, I'm not hungry. Right? Because think of it as I eat food. If I'm storing fat, right? For instance, if I'm if I'm actively producing adipose tissue, do I need to consume food? Nope. Right? Adipose tissue is an abundance of energy. It's the excess. If I'm storing excess, right, like right now in our current quarantine / stay-at-home orders type of thing we're going on, people, if you have an abundance of TP, you don't need to go to the store and buy more. You have enough. Save some for the rest of us. So same thing with the body. If the adipose tissue is growing, if we're actively growing these adipocytes, right? We're actively storing adipose tissue. We don't need to consume further food. So that's where adipose tissue, these adipocytes, begin to produce this hormone called leptin. That leptin then travels up to the hypothalamus, and that's the hypothalamus, and that's how, or that's the relation to the hypothalamus in its ability to regulate satiation. Now, one of the interesting things in obesity, there's a lot of research coming out, has for a few years now, but looking at kind of like where there was insulin resistance, right? Elevated levels of insulin caused the downregulation of the insulin receptor, and people can end up being insulin resistant. Same idea as far as leptin, right? Some people are showing to be leptin resistant, meaning, well, the signs and signals from your adipocytes saying stop eating, you're full, that's not actually happening because we are basically becoming, well, not we, excuse me, some people are becoming leptin resistant. Right, the stomach. Right, the stomach we covered in digestion. Right, the stomach, again, as far as different hormones. Right, gastrin is a hormone released by the stomach. Again, we actually covered this quite a bit in digestion, so I'm just going to kind of move on from here. Here, the kidney. Right, there's a few different hormones which are actually released by the kidney. One is renin. Right, we talked about renin a few minutes ago, probably, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes ago. Renin helps to stimulate the release, well, eventually causes the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to cause you to retain blood volume. Something else that the kidney is going to release is something called EPO, or something called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is going to stimulate the production specifically of red blood cells. Right, so erythropoietin from the kidney actually stimulates red bone marrow to increase the production of red blood cells. And then the heart, cardiac muscle. Right, in the walls of the atrium, right, there's actually something called ANP. It's atrial natriuretic peptide. So that is going to help regulate blood volume. However, the opposite to that of ADH and aldosterone. ADH and aldosterone functioned to increase blood volume levels. Atrial natriuretic peptide functions for just the opposite. It actually wants to decrease blood volume levels. Right, so if just drink a bunch of water, whatever it is, we need to get rid of excess amounts of that water, or the excess amounts of that fluid. One of the things that happens in the heart muscle, specifically within the atrium, that releases this atrial natriuretic peptide, and that stimulates the atrial natriuretic peptide is a diuretic, and that's going to cause you to produce a greater amount of urine. Right, so again, if you have a greater amount of urine, that's going to, or if you have a greater volume of fluid within the blood, the way that your body gets rid of that excess fluid is through the urine. Now, again, these are not the only tissues in the body which produce hormones. Right? Those are the ones that we are going to talk about and discuss. And these are the ones that you should, focus on for the exam. There's other organs like, again, the ovaries, testes, uterus. Those we will cover in reproduction. Right? We will cover those ones in reproduction. So, I would, not that they're not important, not at all. It's just that when we talk about testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, estradiol, estrone, all of those different hormones, they are what literally regulate the entire reproductive function. That's what regulates ovarian cycle. That's what regulates the uterine cycle. That's what regulates sperm production. So those hormones, those tissues, we will cover those when we get to reproduction in 3 or so weeks, or a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out, shoot me an email, and we can discuss.